In this video, we're going to look at learning curves of new technologies. Learning curves look at the relationship between how many of something are produced and the price that it costs. And what we see with a lot of different technologies is that the more we produce of something, the cheaper it gets. This is really relevant when we're thinking about new clean energy technologies like solar panels and windmills, but it applies to a lot of different technologies that are out there. This video draws upon, but also moves beyond, some of the discussion in the second chapter of The Big Fix. So if you want more information about learning curves, that's going to be another good place to look. And again, you should read that chapter as well, but some of the information in this video should help you understand that chapter a little bit better. The man who's most responsible for the idea of learning curves is an engineer by the name of Theodore Wright. Theodore Wright was in aviation at a time where airplanes were a relatively new technology. So in the 1920s, he began researching things about the design, the engineering, and the cost of airplanes. And what some of his research was able to do is help his engineering firms figure out how much it would cost to produce an airplane quite specifically, and with more exactness than a lot of his competitors. So what this meant is that his engineering companies could often produce planes for a cheaper cost because they'd figured out this relationship between production and the cost of producing it. So this information also became very useful to the Allies in World War II because they were looking for ways to make airplanes cheaper to defeat the Nazis in Germany. So a lot of his research had practical implications for the military effort, but after the war, his research helped to make aviation cheaper for everyone. The reason why a lot of us can afford airplane flights today is because of some of the pioneering research that Theodore Wright did. His research, which looked at this relationship between the production of airplanes and their cost getting lower the more airplanes that were produced, became known as Wright's Law, but what we typically call today learning curves. The learning curve cycle basically follows a specific path of how new technologies become cheaper over time. Initially, we have technologies that are too expensive except in a couple of limited areas. But what ends up happening as we start to use those technologies in more places is that they become cheaper and the prices start to fall. When something becomes cheaper, economists tell us that more people will tend to buy it. So again, when something is inexpensive and people can afford it, they tend to get more of it. So once a new product will spread to new markets, and the demand increases, there's an incentive for the company who's designing that technology to make even more of it, and there's also an incentive to make it even cheaper. Because one of the things that companies are worried about is that a competitor might come along and make it even cheaper. So thanks to basically competitive pressures and things like research that a company will do to try to make products more efficiently, with fewer materials, with less waste, is that we tend to get more of them and the prices tend to fall as well. And in fact, more production is exactly what tends to drive the price down. So this cycle can basically repeat itself over and over. And what we see with a lot of technologies as a result is they're more widespread and they become cheaper and cheaper. If you've ever taken an economics class, you may have heard of the idea of an economy of scale. An economy of scale is basically a price advantage that a company might get by producing more of a product. Or another way of saying this is that once you have all of the factory or all of the equipment set up, making more of something is going to make the price of each new thing cheaper and cheaper. So let's take a non-energy example, and let's say that you are interested in opening a takeout pizza restaurant. So pizza ovens are very expensive. I don't know how much exactly, but let's say that a pizza oven costs $50,000. If you are only going to make one pizza in that oven, you would have to sell that pizza for $50,000 to make your money back. If you made 100 pizzas, you'd have to charge about $500 for each of them. But if you made 50,000 pizzas, you'd be able to make your money back by only charging $1 per pizza. So what ends up happening is that as we make more and more of something, we've already paid for some of our costs, so each thing becomes cheaper and cheaper. Now, in the case of the pizza example, obviously you're going to need to buy new ingredients for each pizza. So it's unlikely that you're going to be able to make a pizza really, really cheap or only for $1, at least a pizza that's really good. But for things like the equipment, you've already paid for it when you made your first pizza. So each one is going to reduce the equipment costs that need to go into your profits for each pizza that you make. This kind of pattern happens with a lot of different things. So again, if you only made one car in a factory, that car would be too expensive and nobody bought it. But if you make 1,000,000 cars in that factory, suddenly they become a lot cheaper. So economies of scale basically mean that as we produce more of something in a factory or in a company, that company or factory tends to be able to charge less and less because they've managed to pay for some of their costs. While they still need to buy new materials, other costs, like the cost of the machinery that makes those things, basically you don't have to pay for it more than once, and you can make those things cheaper and cheaper. When you read chapter 2 of The Big Fix, one of the things that you're going to see is that the learning curve and economies of scale were one of the reasons why automobiles, personal cars, became so inexpensive for a lot of people as well. But of course, I want to talk about some technologies that are relevant to helping to solve climate change as well. So if we're just talking about airplanes and cars, obviously they're part of the problem. But it turns out that a lot of Theodore Wright's research and information about learning curves applies to a lot of other technologies as well. So I want to turn our attention to LED light bulbs. These are a lot more efficient than older light bulbs that you used to get, and if you go back even 10 years ago, there weren't a lot of people using them. Nowadays, this is the primary light bulb that's being sold, and part of the reason why is because of what's happening with the learning curve. And this graph shows what we mean by that learning curve. So there's two pieces of information that I want you to catch from this graph here. The blue bars basically tell the price of creating a certain amount of light with an LED light bulb. So this basically corrects for the fact that different light bulbs are of different brightnesses, and that some light bulbs, like old-fashioned ones, basically produce more heat than light. So this is looking at basically how much it costs to produce a set amount of light from a light bulb. So when we go back about 10 years ago to 2010, LEDs were incredibly expensive. And it would cost you about $12.90 to produce a kilolumen or 1,000 lumens of light. So a lumen is just a unit of light energy, and this is what we use to explain how bright a light bulb is. But what you'll see over time is that the cost of producing light from LEDs got really cheap really quickly. And when we fast forward a decade later, it costs less than $1 to produce that same amount of light using those light bulbs. So what ended up happening is that the cost got a lot cheaper. Now the second part of the learning curve is that adaptation or people buying those light bulbs increased more and more. So back in 2010 when LEDs were really expensive, most people didn't think that they were worth the cost. But a few people did find uses for them. Me and my partner were one of the early adopters of LEDs, and we bought a light bulb, I think for about $40 way back then. Now that was incredibly expensive, but I did the math and I figured out that even at that price, we would eventually save money from the electricity we were paying for to power that light bulb. So we got a couple for our house really early on, and maybe some businesses that basically use lighting in certain applications would also find a use for them, even though they're quite expensive. So what ends up happening as they get cheaper and cheaper is that more people figure out ways to use them. So one of the reasons why when you go into restaurants nowadays, like Tim Hortons, you see that television screens are displaying the menus is because they are powered with LEDs and they got really inexpensive. So it's cheap for a restaurant like Tim Hortons to be able to use a LED menu compared to their old ones that were made out of plastic and letters that they had to change. So when we fast forward to 2019, we see that the price of light bulbs is really inexpensive. And this is part of the reason why almost half of all LEDs in 2019 were that kind of light bulb. Basically, as they got cheaper and cheaper, people found them more and more attractive. In our own house, me and my partner have basically replaced all of our lights with LEDs. So it got so cheap and they use so much less electricity, it made sense for us to buy more and more of them. So again, all the learning curve really is it's saying as things get cheaper and cheaper, people tend to adopt more of that technology or they buy more of that technology. And this decreasing price and competitive pressures really makes businesses want to try harder to make their products more efficiently so that they can make them cheaper. Another important thing to point out is that if you're the company that sells the cheapest light bulb, you're going to sell more of them and make more of a profit. So part of what's going on here is that companies are fighting to make things cheaper so that they can sell more of it. This is basically partly a story of how markets work in our economy. This is where I want to turn our attention to considering what's happening with learning curves in different kinds of energy technologies. So this information is brought to us by Hannah Ritchie, the data scientist whose work I've mentioned in previous videos, and she was charting the cost declines or increases of certain kinds of energy between 2009 and 2019. So what was happening over this decade? What we see with solar panels and wind turbines that are placed on the land is that they got a lot cheaper. So the cost of generating electricity from these sources per megawatt hour decreased by about 90% in the case of solar and by 70% in the case of wind. So solar panels and wind turbines are getting much, much cheaper. And as a result, the electricity that they're generating is getting much cheaper as well. Combined cycle gas plants are one type of natural gas electricity plant that's in use. And these are ones that tend to run pretty much all of the time. What we see with gas is that these kinds of power plants also got cheaper, but the cost decline was not nearly as much. So it wasn't nearly as dramatic, but even so, it declined by 32%. Coal hasn't basically changed at all in price. All of these prices, I should mention, are adjusted for inflation, so they do take into account that prices did tend to increase overall. But even so, we find that the cost of coal was virtually unchanged. It's only 2% cheaper. Nuclear power, by contrast, did not follow a learning curve at all, and it's actually gotten even more expensive. So it costs 26% more to generate nuclear power in 2019 than it did 10 years earlier. Now, part of the reason why nuclear power is actually going the opposite direction is because we have a lot more safety features built into nuclear power plants. So in the previous video, I talked about the safety of nuclear power, and while there hasn't been too many accidents so far, people are rightly concerned about making nuclear power as safe as it can be. Those safety mechanisms, unfortunately, do cost money, so part of the reason why nuclear power is getting more expensive is because people are trying to make it safer than it used to be. So I want to explain a little bit about how solar panels managed to get so cheap. The kinds of solar panels that we use today have been around since about the 1950s. But at the time, they were so expensive, they were basically used in only one application. They were used in satellites that were orbiting the Earth. So Imagine that you are sending a satellite into outer space. You do not have very many options for electricity or power. You can't use things like a gas generator because people who are in the satellite would basically die. So if you have anyone who's going to go into outer space in a satellite or in any kind of spacecraft, it's not going to work very effectively. And in any case, some of these satellites didn't have people in them at all, so you wouldn't have people to refill the generator or to switch out the batteries. So solar panels ended up being used as the option because they were basically the only thing you could use to give reliable power in outer space. One of the benefits about satellites as well is because they are in the upper atmosphere, they do get more sun than we do here on Earth. So a lot of solar panels are basically effective for 24 hours a day when they're in outer space. So all of those things basically meant that they made sense in this one limited application. They were still incredibly expensive, but there were basically no other options or no other options that would be cheaper. So into those satellites they went. Fast forward a couple of decades and we start seeing more solar panels in more uses, but they're still not very common and they're still not very expensive. One interesting group that actually adopted the use of solar panels pretty early on, however, were oil and gas companies. Specifically, when they were looking for oil and gas offshore, or the kind of oil and gas that you get by drilling in the ocean. So in these kind of environments, again, it's really expensive to use something like gasoline to constantly have to bring it out to your oil platform to power your electricity to operate the machinery. And they had experimented with batteries as well, but the batteries were really huge. They were needed to be replaced every year. And in some cases, these oil platforms aren't necessarily going to be occupied by any individual. Quite similar to a lot of those early satellites. So while solar panels were very expensive, oil companies used them for offshore platforms because in many cases they got the job done and they were still cheaper than even more expensive alternatives. But again, notice what's happening here. We now have a new market that's essentially going to help with the learning curve. So as oil and gas companies started to use solar panels, there becomes an incentive to try to make them more cheaply and more efficiently, driving down the cost. And what we see basically since the 1970s and the early 1980s is that solar power has gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. It's followed that learning curve to the point now it's become a lot more affordable for more people to install them. So this is one of the reasons why that we see a lot more solar panels than we used to when I was growing up in the 1980s and 90s. You can look around and you can see them on a lot of people's roofs. When I'm going for drives in the country, I see a lot of farms have them set up. In fact, I even pass a couple of farms when I'm driving to visit my parents where there are hundreds of panels set up on giant barn roofs. And people can put up hundreds of solar panels because they got inexpensive. And because they can earn money by selling that electricity or save money by using that electricity themselves. Wind turbines, although we don't get into that story specifically in this lecture, basically followed exactly the same pattern. So again, wind turbines in their modern form have been around since the 1970s, but they weren't widely used because they were too darned expensive. But as more and more people started to install them, they got cheaper and cheaper, creating an incentive to install more and more of them. And that's why if you go for a drive on the 401 highway today, you'll see that there's a lot of wind farms with a lot more turbines set up. This is partly because they got cheaper over time, and putting up those turbines would also make future ones cheaper for the province of Ontario to install as well. So one of the things that I explained in the previous slide is that nuclear power and coal plants have not followed a learning curve. This is a fancy way of saying that they are not getting a lot cheaper over time. And we might ask why this is. Now with coal-powered plants, the fact that it's becoming more and more expensive may actually help us fight climate change because we do not want coal power. If it's expensive and it's polluting, then it would be a no-brainer that we should want to get rid of it. With nuclear power, however, the fact that it's becoming more expensive might be a bit of a problem, because despite its other potential limitations, nuclear power does not create a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So the fact that it's becoming more expensive might be taking away a tool that we could use to fight climate change. Now, there are two really important reasons why nuclear power and coal is not getting cheaper. First of all, when we look at nuclear power plants and coal plants today, they're not being built very often. And what that means is that we're not learning over time how to make them more efficiently and cheaper. And as a result, there is no economy of scale. By contrast, you need a lot of solar panels to be able to generate electricity, enough electricity to even power a house or a business. So we're manufacturing millions of solar panels, and each time that's a new opportunity to try to learn how to make those panels more efficiently and for more cheaply. So the fact that we're producing so few nuclear power plants and coal plants means that we're not learning how to do it better over time. We simply do not have the opportunity to learn how to make them more inexpensive. The other thing that's also an important limitation is that nuclear power and coal plants both require fuel. Nuclear power plants require uranium. Power plants that are coal-based obviously require coal. Now, uranium and coal are never going to be free. They'll always have some kind of cost associated with them, and that's going to limit how far the cost can fall. So what that means is that there's essentially a price floor, that we're going to not be able to lower it below the cost of the fuel. And that fuel is always going to cost money. And in fact, over time, if we use up our coal and nuclear power sources, because they're not renewable, these things could potentially get rarer and rarer over time and more expensive. By contrast, if we're looking at solar panels or wind turbines, the fuels that they need are free. Sunlight is going to be free as long as the sun is burning, which is going to be for billions of years. Wind is basically a side effect of the sun, and so as long as the sun is shining, we're always going to have some kind of wind. So the fuel that these sources of energy use is basically free. So the only thing we are paying for is the technology to harness that source of energy. The fuel is free. And unfortunately, it's not going to be the case for something like nuclear and coal plants. Natural gas is an interesting case because it is a fossil fuel, which we want to get rid of, but it has actually followed the learning curve that solar and wind have. It hasn't dropped as dramatically in price, but it has gone down over time. One of the reasons why this is because a lot of our natural gas today has benefited from 40 or 50 years of research into fracking technologies. When natural gas is fracked, basically drillers will drill a hole deep down into the bedrock, and they will start to inject things like water, sand, and chemicals to basically pressurize that drilling. What ends up happening is the shale or the rock where a lot of natural gas is stored will start to crack and fracture, and it basically becomes loose, and we can harvest it, we can get it out of the ground. So fracking is basically a really complicated way of breaking up the rock and basically extracting the natural gas that's stored in that rock. When fracking technology first started to get researched in the 1970s, like a lot of our other technologies that we've discussed, it was incredibly expensive. And so it didn't make sense for most people to try to get natural gas out of the ground in this way. However, in the 2000s and 2010s, when natural gas prices started to increase, there was suddenly a lot more interest in fracking. And so what ended up happening is that we started to build more and more fracking operations. And that gave companies that wanted to get natural gas out of the ground more opportunities to try to make fracking more efficient. In other words, they were increasing demand, and each time they built a new drilling facility to get natural gas out, there was an opportunity to make the cost even cheaper. So natural gas was able to follow the learning curve thanks to improvements in fracking technology, which made it cheaper to get natural gas out of the ground. However, a lot of people are concerned that we're not going to be able to continue to make natural gas cheaper over time. And partly this is because natural gas is a fuel. So again, just like nuclear power plants that require uranium and coal plants that require coal, we're always going to need to get natural gas out of the ground. The fuel is not going to be free. And once again, that's going to create that price floor. That means that we're not going to be able to get below it. We're always going to need to pay something for that natural gas. The other problem is that fracking creates a lot of other environmental problems. Specifically, there's a lot of concerns that it can pollute the water table as well. So again, if you're getting some of these fracking chemicals in your drinking water, suddenly you're not going to have drinking water. And a lot of communities for this reason have moved to restrict or even ban fracking technology. And of course, we also want to bring up the fact that natural gas is still creating a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So even if we could make natural gas more cheaply, it's still producing too many emissions and we're going to have to phase it out. So for all of these reasons, while it's getting cheaper, it's not necessarily the best option for us going forward. One final really important point about learning curves is that initially, the technology is often so expensive that it could get stuck and not be widely adopted. And one of the things that we need to do if we want to adopt new technologies that we want to make inexpensive is to consider using things like government subsidies to make them cheaper, at least in the short term. A government subsidy is basically some kind of rebate or some kind of incentive to buy something based on its advantages or its benefits that it offers to people. So airplanes, when they were first being produced by the military, were not something that were being produced for a profit. These were being produced because countries needed to win wars. And so governments were basically paying to build those airplanes. They were subsidizing their use because we thought that democracy and freedom was important, so we needed to defeat the Nazis when we fought in World War II. One of the other things that we also see benefited from government subsidies are those LED light bulb technologies. So a few years ago, you used to see a lot of coupons that you could use to save money on buying those light bulbs. So by saving money, it basically made people adopt that technology more, and it helped to drive down the cost of future light bulbs. And the reason why the government of Ontario did this is because if we're using less electricity, like these LED light bulbs do, then we're also going to need to have fewer power plants and we're going to be producing fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So in this case, one of the reasons why they were providing this benefit is that they were essentially paying people for some of those nice benefits that were being produced by the adaptation of those technologies. I pointed out with the solar panel example that satellites were benefited from early solar panels. So again, governments were essentially paying for that technology because they thought there was a benefit to having satellite communications in outer space, to be able to do scientific research in outer space, and all of that other thing. And again, this would help with later programs in making solar panels, again, even more cheap in the future. In the recent past, this is also one of the reasons why the government has helped people install solar panels on their household roofs. So again, the idea is that solar panels and solar electricity doesn't produce as many emissions. And as a result, we have benefits like cleaner air. We have more electricity on sunny and hot days. So a lot of those solar panels are helping to keep our electricity system stable when a lot of people need air conditioning or other forms of cooling. So the idea behind a government subsidy is that they help essentially lower the cost when it's very expensive. Once you lower the cost enough, you may not necessarily need to give subsidies anymore. So again, LED light bulbs and solar panels are now in many cases so cheap that we don't necessarily need any government support to encourage people to use them. And again, this essentially was one of the things that helped drive the cost down for anyone. So even if you didn't personally partake in any of these programs, you are receiving a lot of the benefits that they've helped to create. So to summarize some of the key take-home messages of this video, learning curves, which are also known as Wright's law, basically points out that as technologies become cheaper, their deployment increases. So the cheaper they are, the more of them they produce, and the more we produce, the cheaper they tend to get. This is because different companies who manufacture the things that we want learn how to make that more efficiently. And this helps to create a cycle which basically makes them cheaper and cheaper so that more and more people want to buy them. And as more people want to buy them, it encourages the company to continue doing research to try to make them even more cheaper. Because they want to be able to outcompete other businesses that are also producing that same technology. And because the more of something they sell, the more profit that they can potentially make. So what we have seen from this video as well is that a lot of the technologies that we need to fight climate change, such as wind turbines and solar panels, and more efficient lighting that LED light bulbs have given us, have become cheaper over time. They are technologies that have benefited directly from this learning curve process. Other technologies such as nuclear power plants and fossil fuels have not. And unfortunately, in the case of nuclear, this is something that might prevent us from adopting it more widely. So what we want to try to do to fight climate change is to find more of these technologies that follow learning curves and potentially consider doing things like providing subsidies or government support to encourage people to adopt technologies that help to fight climate change. And by doing so, one of the things that we can do is potentially make that technology cheaper for everyone so that more and more people will use it. And again, when you're walking around and you see a house with solar panels on it, think to yourself that this is one of the things that have benefited from this learning curve and this research that went into making those solar panels more and more efficient, more and more cheap over time.